Dogs, 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 dogs. Who doesn't love them? This is exactly what Dmitry Belyaev thought oh so long ago. Born in 1917 in Soviet Russia, Dmitry was an academic with a passion for genetics. He worked right here. Wait, no, right here, where he was the director of the Institute of Cytology and Genetics. His most famous research came in the 1950s when him and his team began, quote, arguably the most extraordinary breeding experiment ever conducted, end quote. Belyaev and his grad student Lyudmila Trut, who was selected to be the manager of the program, selectively bred silver foxes. Now, for some context, selective breeding is a term coined by the ever-famous Charles Darwin, who is most known for his interest in studies in genealogy. For all you Darwin heads out there, and to all you non-Darwin heads out there, it is important to remember that although he was a great scientist, he is also on record in his book saying that non-whites are savages in both moral disposition and in intellect, which is insane. But we can expand on this further in another video. Anyway, Dmitry and Trut started the experiment out by rounding up around 30 male foxes and around 100 female foxes.
Well, technically, female foxes are just vixens.
Shut up, nerd.
Most of the foxes were actually from a commercial fur farm out in Estonia. The group only let a select group of foxes breed based on their tameness. The most crucial part for this experiment was ensuring that foxes not be trained, essentially proving that their tameness can come from genetic selection as opposed to outside impact. Sounds familiar to another conceptual debate. There were a few other rules that had to be followed, according to Dmitry. From birth, the foxes are to be tested every month until they reach sexual maturity. This test was pretty simple. A scientist would attempt to pet and interact with the fox while offering food, and then the scientist or an observing scientist would note the behavior. Most importantly, if the fox would actually have interest in the scientist or would rather be with the other foxes. Unfortunately, this method of testing meant that the foxes spent most of their infancy in cages in order to not allow for outside interference. Foxes reach sexual maturity at around 7 to 8 months. And once these tested foxes hit that age, they were given one final round of tests and were assigned an overall tameness score. Honestly, this next part is my favorite part of the tests. Basically, they were giving points to the foxes for approaching the scientist, but they later realized they had to take away points because some of the foxes would approach only to bite the scientist. After these final rounds of tests, the foxes get placed into 3 distinct classes of tameness. First is Class 3. Class 3 contains the ones who are not domesticated or have very little signs of domestication. Based on these tests, we can assume it was basically the foxes that did not like human contact and would prefer to just spend their time with the other foxes. Class 2 are the funny ones who allow human contact, but in Trut's words, don't respond with friendliness. And finally, we have Class 1, which are all the foxes that are overall just friendly with humans. Things were actually going so well that after only 6 generations, the team had to add another category, designated Class IE, or Class Elite. These foxes were the creme de la creme. They were not only eager for human contact, but were doing things to attract human contact, like whimpering or licking the scientist. And low-key, the craziest part is that the foxes would show all these traits before they even turned a month old. According to the paper, the tameness score improved with every single generation. That's really impressive. Sidebar, context, facts. Okay, this is some necessary context for this next part, so bear with me for a second.
Silver foxes exist in seasonally monogamous pairs for the breeding months of December to April, and most matings occur in January and February. Female silver foxes, or vixens, are monoestrus, having 1 estrus cycle per year, with estrus lasting 1 to 6 days, and parturition occurring after 52 days after gestation.
Basically, foxes are monogamous queens and kings who mate and breed in the winter. Vixens only have 1 cycle in heat, or estrus, per year, which lasts around 1 to 6 days. And then they have around a 2-month pregnancy before a tiny little baby fox pops out. Aww. Due to this, the first few generations just simply took time to get to a point where they could make changes. To be precise, it took exactly 1. That's right, 1 generation for significant internal change. And by as early as the 4th generation, more visible traits began to show. In the 3rd generation, we get a really important step in this domestication process. The most tame of the females began what is called pre-estrus, which basically meant that they would be in heat earlier than the normal breeding/mating season. They would have this nearly 3 months earlier than usual, basically November as opposed to January. In the fourth generation, as mentioned before, we get our first external changes. Most notably, one male fox began, to use their quotes, tail wagging. By the eighth generation, the change in the mating season had gotten so early that vixens had a full mating period and pregnancy, and then were able to have a second pregnancy later in the year. Which, from an on paper science perspective, is really cool. But this feels so odd morally. Also, for all you science heads out there, I know the terms I'm using are not technically correct, but they get the point across, damn it. By the time the 10th generation rolled around, some of the domesticated foxes began having floppy ears and curly tails. Aww. By generation 15, the stress hormone, glucocorticoid, was damn near halved, and the adrenal gland, or the adrenaline, was continuing to get smaller. All the while, their levels of serotonin continued to grow. To put it into normal words that I can say and understand, this means they were just becoming chill dudes. In these 15 generations, the foxes also had some more tremendous growth in their physical features as well. The team found that they had mutt-like fur patterns and they had more juvenile face features. One that I thought was pretty funny, their body shapes were, quote, chunkier rather than gracile limbs, quote.
Instant replay. Chunkier, chunkier, chunkier.
Basically, we were getting some cute ass fucking foxes. So listen, all the way back in the 1950s, Dmitry had a hypothesis that a large part of the domestication process was going to be basically some genes turning off and then some genes turning on, which turned out to come to fruition according to a 2018 study by the Wang Group. They, quote, found more than 100 genes in the prefrontal cortex to express different gene patterns, quote. It also included the foxes essentially mutating the gene, which is associated with memory and learning, according to the Kukekova group in 2018. Blah, 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 science stuff. Basically, these foxes showed all the signs and traits of being domesticated, they're super cute, and they can probably learn tricks now. Tragically, at 68 years old, Dmitry passed away of cancer in 1985. RIP. The torch was passed on to Trut to continue running the experiment. In 1999, Trut wrote, quote, after 40 years of the experiment and the breeding of 45,000 foxes, a group of animals had emerged that were as tame and as eager to please as a dog, end quote. Apparently, the foxes lost their, quote, foxy musk, quote, and yes, that is a real direct quote and a real thing, and according to sources had become quite the domesticated animal. However, as in most science to do with animals, there is a real and unfortunate reality that must be faced. In order to have 45,000 foxes over 40 years and tens of generations means a pretty not ideal living condition, to say the least. Caridwen Terrell of Concordia University visited the farm in 2012 and described it as, quote, dilapidated army barracks with rows and rows of shed that house about 100 foxes each, end quote. She did also mention, though, that the foxes were so tame that they loved having their bellies scratched. While these are tough scenes to think about and consider, the work was incredibly impactful and important. To be honest, though, trying to find a silver lining outside of the data is hard. But I guess one thing is I think some people may have learned some more compassion and empathy for animals as a whole. Learning that any animal is theoretically a step away from being just as domesticated as a dog or a cat could be impactful for people who maybe didn't have this type of thinking before. Some people are just less empathetic to things they do not perceive as useful to humans. And hopefully this was able to help them turn a corner. Either way, it is very much worth mentioning the ethics and the morals of an experiment like this. There's no denying the lack of humanity in a process such as this experiment. The question, I think, comes down to, do you think it was worth it? I'm always curious to gain more perspective on these types of morality questions, as it helps me further progress in my own viewpoint. In a very smooth transition that was easy to think of, let's get back to the story. In 1991, when the USSR officially collapsed, so did many of the research programs with it. One of the more notable research losses was the work of the Energia rocket, but we can talk about that another time. Trut and Dmitry struggled to even keep the foxes alive during this time. And with Dmitry passing in the middle of the Soviets' collapse, there was even more burden to take on. Trut fought really hard and valiantly to keep the research going, but it was a lot of work and money. Eventually, Kukakova, who we mentioned earlier, heard about the financial situation, shall we say? Kukakova worked incredibly hard to secure funding from the National Institute of Health, which, sidebar, is the very one that Donald Trump and Elon Musk have recently slashed funding to, by the way. And Kukakova actually joined Trut in seeing out this project. This was a massive step in Russian American relations. Due to the immense success of the project, there is not as much need to keep up with the near 2,000 foxes they had back in 2012. The farm as of 2016 actually consists of around 270 tame vixens and around 70 tame males on the farm. They actually made a few of the tame foxes available to be pets, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. First, they can probably get some funding by selling these domesticated foxes. It also just raises awareness that this is a program that's happening. Another great point brought up by Raymond Coppinger of Hampshire College is that this is probably also to ensure their survivability in case there were to be a disease spread in the farm. In 2010, in fact, 2 of the foxes were actually seized at the US border after some shady dealings, and the Austin Zoo took care of them. There was an attempt to have some of these foxes go to Finland, but unfortunately the colony there is no longer surviving, which means all the known tamed foxes are still in Russia, some as pets, some in research. In fact, the translator for Raymond Coppinger, who we mentioned earlier, one Luda Mekercheva, has 2 of them, who are wonderful companions who, quote, jump on my back when I kneel to give them food, sit when I pet them, and take vitamins from my hand, end quote. All in all, this was a really successful experiment solely from a science perspective. I honestly do not know enough about the ethical issues with this study, and truth be told, I've really struggled to form a strong perspective solely from the research I've done online. If any of you have a better perspective or more understanding of this that they can share with me, I would really appreciate it. This experiment proved many theories correct and probably inspired a whole new generation of genealogists who get to look back at these experiments and learn what to, and more importantly, what not to do going forward. The lab survived so many wars, the collapse of an empire, the deaths of countless foxes, even the death of the head researcher. So many things were destined to go wrong, but in the end, these underdogs came out on top.